And welcome back to the last two sections of Chapter 11 on consciousness and sleeping and dreaming. What we're going to be doing is covering a fair amount of the issues of sleeping and dreaming and hypnosis in this section, all related to consciousness. Consciousness being an extension of the issues of attention that we were dealing with earlier. How is human consciousness defined? Consciousness is defined by the awareness of ourselves, our internal states, and the environment, which is usually a very general statement. In fact, consciousness is not like you're defining something in a very specific way, identifying a brain area, brain circuit, an exact functional process. Consciousness is still very broadly defined because it's not very clear exactly what it is. And I have to be very careful when I say something like that because a lot of mumbo jumbo surrounds the story of consciousness. So when you say you don't really understand what it is, it kind of sounds like maybe I'm adding to the mumbo jumbo. Consciousness really is a reflection of all the things your brain can do at any one time. And that's simply beyond our ability to model in theories or even mathematical models today. It's an overreach of our scientific abilities. And the issue was started right at the beginning of the field of psychology in 1879. So there's never been a point where consciousness could be fully understood simply because it was defined too broadly for the researchers to deal with it in 1879 or even the researchers to deal with it in the early 21st century. The primary issue, though, is that consciousness is really engaging all the processes of your brain and all the possible interactions between those various systems. And that is a huge amount. So general statements are made regarding the role of consciousness and how it functions, but unless you specify a particular part of the system into a smaller piece that you can work with, you're generally going to have to talk about consciousness in generalities. And your text here is not really making an attempt to do that. It's following that typical way that many psychologists tend to do, like you see again in this definition. Awareness is described by what we have of ourselves, our internal states, and the environment. That's a very vague statement and says very little, frankly. One of the things about it, though, if you try to specify a little bit more, is that it's a state that almost always requires language when you're dealing with a human being. So if you were dealing with animal consciousness, language is not a primary issue, but when you're dealing with human beings, then language is very important. And language is always a behavioral state because a little voice inside your head that's operating and telling you the most deepest, greatest thoughts that anybody's ever had since the beginning of time is not something anybody is aware of or can work with if you don't actually explain it and repeat it to somebody. And as soon as you do, you then have behavior. So it's one of the aspects about psychology that is not really dealt with in this manual at this particular point, but you must always have overt behavior to measure anything. And that includes consciousness, despite the fact that most people will tend to overemphasize the fact that consciousness is a thing that exists in your brain and doesn't involve behavior, which is not really an accurate statement. But let's just keep with the definition that's in the book here and kind of manage it. Could you prove that someone has no consciousness even if they use language, like the zombie up on the screen here, right? The zombie walks around and says brains, so therefore he's speaking English. Now the fact that he's speaking English, does that indicate that he's actually thinking about brains? how tasty they are, where he's going to get them, how much brains he's had last week, or is just a reflexive response coming out of a reanimated corpse that says brains? That's the question. And frankly, the reason why this question comes up now is because you can't distinguish between the two. Whether or not the zombie just says brains and only brains and also has a thought about brains, or says brains and nothing but brains and has no thought in its head but just is saying the word brains, is a thing that simply cannot be distinguished at the current time, even if you brain scan the stupid zombie, simply because if you found a difference between the area of the rotten brain of a zombie that says brains and thinks about brains versus the zombie that just says brains and doesn't think about it, you would be in a difficult position, because I just tricked you. I told you that one of the zombies says brains and thinks about it, but how would you know that it thinks about it? Because all it ever says is brains. If you brain scanned a bunch of zombies and some of them had one area of the rotten brain light up and another one had two areas of its rotten brain light up, would you say that there's a subdivision of zombies that think about brains simply because there's another area of the brain that lights up? There's no way to tell. That's the conundrum in this particular case. That's the issue with thought as a primary source of data for psychology that simply doesn't work. If you can't get the person to exhibit overt behavior and explain what they're thinking or even act things out, then you're stuck and you don't actually know what to associate the brain activity with in terms of overt behavior, and you're back to zero again. This moves us on to sleep. Yay, sleep. Sleep is the thing that occurs before you turn into a zombie, because first you fall asleep and then you turn into a zombie. Sleep occurs on a 24-hour cycle. All right, obviously, sleep always starts with stage 1 sleep, travels all the way up to stage 4 sleep, and then backwards. So as sleep stages occur, when you first fall asleep, you go into stage 1, then stage 2, then stage 3, then stage 4, then backwards to stage 3, backwards to stage 2, and then you would go back to stage 1, except you don't ever return to stage 1. You replace stage 1 with REM sleep. And we're going to see this structure on the next slide in a figure where I show you how the various sleep stages interact with each other. What you should see on this particular image here is the fact that the brainwave activity from stage 1 to stage 4 follows the same pattern. And that is, from stage 1 to stage 4, the wavelength and the amplitude become larger. And when you go from stage 4 to stage 1, the wavelength and the amplitude become smaller. Wavelength and amplitude are positively correlated together. From stage 1, you have small of each, and in stage 4, you have large ones of each. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Notice that on the very bottom of the image, the REM sleep brainwave pattern is actually very similar to the stage 1 brainwave pattern. So as I mentioned, when you go to sleep, you go to stage 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 3, then 2. And when you would return to 1, you're returning to REM. You're actually going into REM sleep, which is a sleep stage which is distinguishable from stage 1, but is actually relatively similar to it. Here are the sleep stages that you experience as you go to sleep. In this particular figure, when you're awake, you're exhibiting, we'll say, alpha waves, which is a type of brainwave pattern indicating that you are awake. When you go to sleep, you will start in the stage 1, as I've said, then 2, then 3, then 4, then work your way to 3, to 2, and when you would return to stage 1, you actually go into REM sleep. Now, over the course of the evening, you don't experience the exact same pattern that I have on the screen here, but you do something very similar. Typically, An individual will go through all of the stages from 1 down to 4 and back up to REM until they acquire enough stage 4 sleep. Then they will only go down to stage 3 sleep. When they have acquired enough stage 3 sleep, then they will only go down to stage 2 sleep. And that's essentially where the process will end. When you go to stage 2 sleep, you're only going to return up to REM, and so you go back and forth between REM and 2, REM and 2, REM and 2 until you eventually wake up. Now notice on the x-axis, each of the vertical lines there is representative of a 90-minute cycle. So if we make the assumption for simple numbers that whenever you fall asleep on this figure, you're falling asleep at midnight, that means the very first vertical line after 90 minutes is 1:30 in the morning. The next one is 3 in the morning. The next one's 4:30 in the morning. The next one's 6 in the morning. The next one would be 7:30 in the morning. Now, why this 90-minute cycle thing is important is because you dream every 90 minutes. And that is a biological constant across all people. You typically will have in a scenario like this, when you fall asleep at midnight, you're going to wind up having a dream at 1:30 in the morning for about 10 minutes. And over the course of the evening, if you look at the figure, as you experience fewer and fewer total stages, like you don't go to stage 4 anymore, you don't go to stage 3 anymore, you still maintain the 90-minute cycle for dreaming. Therefore, the length of time you spend in each stage increases. So by the end of the evening, you're only in REM sleep or in stage 2, but still on a 90-minute cycle, which means it's very likely that you're going to dream for 45 continuous minutes toward the end of the morning. And that is, of course, when you're more likely to actually wake up to start your day and wake up in a dream so that you remember your dream. Typically, what's going to happen is you have to wake up during a dream to know that you had it. If you wake up outside of a dream, then it's unlikely that you will remember it. And there's kind of a side thing here that your book doesn't really talk about, but I'll just throw this at you to help try to make the whole thing make a little bit more rational sense. When you go to sleep, you do have a sensory register and a short-term memory from the memory system, but you no longer have a long-term memory system, largely because long-term memory is predicated upon you using the process of rehearsal to keep information in short-term memory long enough so that it turns into a long-term memory. If you do not do that, which you don't do when you're asleep, you simply don't form long-term memories of the time when you're unconscious and sleeping. If you wake up in a dream, then you will remember about the last 30 seconds of it. Even if you wake up at the very end of the 45-minute dream, you have a short-term memory that can retain only about 30 seconds. And so you will only remember the last 30 seconds of a continuous 45-minute dream. Your memory system and sleeping work together, but your memory system does not change just because you're sleeping. So when you wake up and you have a dream that seemed like it was really long, that's probably just a temporal illusion, right? Because all sorts of things can happen in your dream. You can fly and see zombies and, travel to the center of the earth and fly around the sun. None of it's real, of course. And the fact that you can have a distorted sense of time during a dream is also a perfectly reasonable thing to experience. And so sometimes you will experience a dream that you would think must have taken much longer than 30 seconds, but it's just a time distortion as part of the dream itself. Now, REM sleep, as you probably are familiar with, REM is an acronym that stands for rapid eye movement. It was called rapid eye movement in the 1950s when it was first discovered, largely because individuals during REM sleep appear to be awake in terms of their electroencephalogram. And during the 50s, when research was taking place, individuals that went into REM sleep caused the researchers to go in and find out why they were awake, but they actually saw that these individuals were asleep and their eyes were darting around in their head. If they woke the individuals up, the person would most likely, and actually with a 90% probability, report that they were having a dream. So the researchers back in the 50s began to associate the dream state where your eyes dart around in your head as being associated with dreaming, and that's where we get this connection, REM sleep and dreaming. You might remember as well, as just part of a sidebar historical connection, I mentioned in a previous lecture in the same chapter that the electroencephalogram really didn't become actively used until around the 1930s, when it was finally developed into a usable technology. It took about 20 years before anybody got around to applying that EEG to sleeping. And that's what you actually see here. So it was all EEG research on sleep that was occurring in the 50s that led to this discovery. When you dream and you are in REM sleep, you will experience body paralysis. And this is a rather odd thing, but all of us have actually experienced it at one time or another. Usually as a result of a nightmare that is a very exciting, troublesome event, you begin to wake up. As you wake up, you may feel that you can't move your body. You actually are paralyzed during this time period because you were dreaming. When a person goes into REM sleep, any of the motor messages that are part of the dream itself that exist in the primary motor cortex are actually generating action potentials and being sent out to muscles. However, there are blocks to the outgoing motor messages in your brain stem that become active during the time of REM sleep. As a result, any of the motor messages in your primary motor cortex cannot exit actually out of your brain stem and will never make it to your muscles. As a result, your body becomes completely limp during REM sleep, and that is what body paralysis is. So if you're having a nightmare and you start to wake up and you feel like you can't move, it's because you literally can't move. And until you wake up sufficiently and come out of REM sleep, you're not going to be able to control your body because you have to turn off that body paralysis from REM sleep itself. This body paralysis aspect keeps people from acting out their dreams. In fact, there's a disorder called REM sleep disorder, which is not named very well, but it's very descriptive. REM sleep disorder most likely occurs in the elderly, and what it is a scenario in which the outgoing motor messages during REM sleep are no longer blocked, so that whatever dream you have, you actually get out of bed and start to act it out. And as you might imagine, some people can get hurt as they run around the room stubbing their toe and falling through windows and doing other kinds of crazy things. They're not really interacting with the room that they're in. They're interacting with the dream that they have, and therefore they're going to bump into furniture and knock things over and get themselves hurt, and this can become actually rather serious. Now, of course, when you dream, you're going to have specific types of emotional or content experience of the dreams themselves. And the work of dreams has been studied over many decades. For sure, if you're not familiar with this, the idea that you can read into your dreams secret messages is an idea that has long since been discarded by scientific psychology. The idea that you should analyze your dreams for meaning has no place in modern scientific psychology at all. As you're going to see here, dreams are made by very predictable content. First, the emotional experience or the emotional content of a dream is generally determined by the emotional content of your experience during the course of the day. So if it's summertime and you're not doing a whole lot, maybe like when you were 16, you're more likely to have happy dreams during that time period. But if it's final exam week and you're in college, you are more likely to have nightmares just because you're more anxious during that time. Now, apart from the emotional content, the specific plot line of a dream can clearly be determined by the very last experience you have before you go to sleep. And it's just that straightforward. If you watch the movie Frankenstein right before you go to sleep, at midnight, based on the figure that we had on the previous slide, the very first dream cycle you have is very likely to be about Frankenstein or spooky castles or vampires or werewolves or other things that are just peripherally related to a Frankenstein. And that's exactly what's going to happen. You can make yourself have a dream of certain material, usually in that first dream cycle. The following dream cycles all seem to be peripherally related to the previous dream cycle. So if you watch Frankenstein before you go to sleep, at 1:30 you'll have a dream about Frankenstein. At 3 o'clock in the morning, you might have a dream about going to Frankfurt, Germany. And an hour and a half later, at 4:30 in the morning, when you have a dream, you might be talking to your friend named Francis or Frank. Or somebody will be speaking to you frankly. There'll be some sort of peripheral connection one way or the other. And of course, I'm focused on the Frankenstein, Frankfurt, speaking frankly aspect of this. But the content of the dream will lay out various possibilities, and then there will be a connection from one portion of the dream to the next dream cycle an hour and a half later. And so when you evaluate this with many subjects over the course of decades, you can see how the content of a dream plays itself out. The fact that most people are not aware of the fact that they give themselves a particular dream is simply because when you go to bed, you're very unlikely to wake up in that first dream cycle 90 minutes later because you're going to sleep the entire evening. So even though the dream that you have in the first dream cycle may be very logically related to the last thing that happens before you go to sleep, very few people ever actually see that. In fact, the only times you might wind up seeing that is if you were studying a lot and you fell asleep and then you wind up having a dream 90 minutes later, and then for some reason maybe you woke up because you had to use the restroom or something. You'd recognize that you were dreaming about the material that you had been studying. But that's a much less likely scenario to occur simply because most people don't wake up at that point in the evening. You're much more likely to wake up in the morning. Now this moves us over to hypnosis, which is another aspect of consciousness and awareness and attention. Hypnosis, as the process that you recognize today, was developed in 1843 by a Scottish physician named James Braid. Braid is the person responsible for swinging a pocket watch in front of somebody's face to try to get them to pay attention to it. But there's no need to swing a pocket watch in front of somebody's face. Modern hypnotherapists, the very few that still exist, will generally have a person sit calmly, focus on a point on the wall, or just kind of get wrapped up in their own thoughts in a meditative manner to get into a meditative state of focused concentration for the hypnotherapy session to begin. And so it's a straightforward thing. The therapist will just ask you to calmly relax, to focus on your own thoughts and to relax, and that will kind of get the hypnosis session started. One thing you should be very aware about hypnosis is that it is not at all a type of state that the hypnotherapist engages on the client against their will. Hypnosis is very much a social phenomenon. The hypnotherapist plays a role and the patient plays a role. And they both have to do their job for the hypnotic session to actually work out properly. But if a person goes to a hypnotherapist and says, please help me stop smoking, And then the hypnotherapist puts them into a trance and is telling them about smoking, but then starts telling them to go rob banks and murder their spouse and do all kinds of other crazy things. The individual who's been hypnotized is simply going to remember all this, and in fact may even snap out of the hypnotic state, because it's not like they're a zombie being controlled by the hypnotherapist, which is kind of the old Hollywood version of hypnosis from horror movies in the 1930s, but rather the individual is fully aware of what's actually going on. And if they're given commands to go murder and rob banks and so forth, they're just going to be completely aware of all of these odd commands. And obviously, they're not going to allow themselves to be hypnotized at all. So they'll just snap out of it. What kind of things would hypnotized people do? Well, they will not do anything against their free will. So just as I've mentioned, that's the reason why. Anything a person's willing to do, you can hypnotize them to help them do it. But if they're not willing to do it, they simply won't do it. And if you give them commands to do it, it just won't have any bearing, because they'll come out of the hypnotic state and tell you to stop saying those things. Or, report you to the authorities, depending upon what it actually is. Post-hypnotic suggestions is kind of an odd aspect of the whole thing, where you give a person suggestions during the process of hypnosis, and these individuals will be more likely to act these things out for a brief period of time, not permanently. Post-hypnotic suggestions have a lifespan of a couple of hours, maybe at best, where it just basically dies off. The effects of post-hypnotic suggestions is not very long-lived. And again, they're not going to be extremely strong either. Plus, they have to be things that the person is willing to do. Otherwise, you could have them, use a post-hypnotic suggestion to go murder people against their will. So in ridiculous cases like magic shows, you have an individual cluck like a chicken when the doorbell rings. And of course, that's all very entertaining. And if you go to a magic show and there's a hypnotherapist there and he calls people up on stage, there are going to be people that are going to raise their hand and, try to get attention so that the magician brings them up on stage because they really want to be part of the show. And there are other people that put their hands down because they don't want any part of it. The people that don't want to be a part of it are not going to get hypnotized because they don't want to be hypnotized. They're not going to participate in the whole hypnosis process. So the magician is not going to pick any of those individuals. They will pick the people that are waving their hands wildly, that definitely want to be part of the show, because that is essentially ensuring that this person is going to go up there and play a role of a hypnotized individual and do what they're supposed to do, because they're having fun, right? They're having fun doing this. If you're actually using hypnosis for a clinical sense, these post-hypnotic suggestions will help to a minor degree for things like craving your interest in smoking cigarettes, or getting angry when you're stuck in traffic, or other kinds of things. But hypnosis is a fairly weak, fairly short-lived influence on your behavior. So it does work. It's just weak and short-lived. As a result, you can't really do a whole lot with it. And even though hypnosis has kind of been around in a realistic sense for maybe about 100 years or so as people have used it, despite the fact that it goes back to 1843, it was not used a whole lot, but it was used a lot more in the 20th century. There are many more therapeutic techniques to get a person to change their behavior than hypnosis, and hypnosis itself is just largely dying out. So you could use it. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing unethical about it, but it's just not a very good technique, and it's generally not worth your effort to bother paying for if you're going to get such a tiny effect out of it. So what can you do with a hypnosis? Some general things. You can help people try to stop smoking. You can reduce aspects of social anxiety, manage their emotions like anger management. Those are the things that they typically get used for. For individuals that might have anxiety disorders, they may opt to use hypnosis as part of a systematic desensitization process where you need to stay relaxed during a time during which maybe you're exposed to a phobic experience. So hypnosis will kind of help in that case because a specific hypnotic trance may be a little bit more helpful than the person just trying to meditate themselves. But there's a blending of those two processes. Meditating yourself and hypnosis is just kind of two ends of basically the same thing. You cannot uncover lost memories or past lives through hypnosis. And I can understand saying the uncover lost memories aspect. That idea comes from Freud. Another crappy idea from Sigmund Freud. Freud had suggested that an individual will have traumatic emotional experiences and then block them out with one of his defense mechanisms, but that you could use hypnosis to uncover what those particular emotional experiences were. And as Freud has gone into the trash can of therapies, so has the idea of using hypnosis to uncover lost memories. I can't believe I'm saying it, but I just got to be clear. The idea that you can regress somebody backward in time to an earlier point in their life is Freud's. And then I'm not exactly sure, but some knucklehead has decided that you could then go even further to negative age and regress a person back into a past life. And that's when you hear about everybody was hypnotized into a previous life and, always becomes Blackbeard or King James the First or Queen Elizabeth or, some other great figure. But they're never some poor schlub that digs in the dirt for potatoes and is starving half their life before they die from cholera. It's just, you always see people having this past life as something important. And when you hypnotize people into their supposed past life and you ask them simple questions that a person from the previous life would actually know, like who's the king, what does money look like, who's in charge of the ship, they get those kinds of answers wrong because they don't have a past life that they can be hypnotized to. But this is some of the nonsense that you see kind of connected to psychology. It's not oftentimes psychologists themselves, but it is the inappropriate application of psychological principles that will wind up playing itself out on TV and making psychologists look like a bunch of idiots. Hypnosis can't be used as a replacement for anesthetic unless there is a fairly minor injury overall. So probably one of the most common cases of hypnosis being used in terms of medical treatments that engage pain is the dentist. And it works just fine there. Some people, provided they can be hypnotized properly, can get through having their teeth drilled without anesthetic, simply because they were hypnotized properly. And in some cases, individuals don't tolerate anesthetic well, and hypnosis may actually be one of the few options for those individuals. And as a result, you may eventually hear about occasional uses of it, sometime into the future. Some people may just decide to use it instead of anesthetic for other personal reasons. Taking off in a completely different direction, in terms of consciousness, there's the issue of drug addiction. And drug addiction is connected to the broader story here of consciousness, largely because the whole story of drug addiction is about what you are aware of, what kinds of things you want, what kinds of things you're aware of. And certainly drug addiction is going to wind up affecting the kinds of things that you focus on. So that's why this issue is here. But there are some fundamental things about drugs and psychology that may not be immediately clear that we'll see on the next couple of slides. All drug addiction is associated with reward, tolerance, and dependence. And you have to be very clear about what you mean regarding reward, tolerance, and dependence. Reward is always referring to positive reinforcement. So it's something, an action you take that adds the drug into your experience that makes it more likely that you're going to do it again in the future. That's what reward is. People don't take drugs that make them sick and only sick, right? They take drugs that get them high, or they'll take drugs that maybe they don't get high from so much anymore, but that cut back or avoid some of the withdrawal symptoms that they're experiencing. But that's still going to kind of be a basis of reward for it. Tolerance and dependence are things that you have to be very aware of. Tolerance, like for those of you that drink coffee, may recognize that as you drink coffee the first time, you can get a big jolt of excitement from it. As you continue to drink coffee, though, you're going to get less and less excitement or less energy from it. And then you're going to have to start drinking more and more coffee to be able to get the same level of energy from the caffeine itself. That's what tolerance is. When you need more drug over time to reach the same high you originally obtained. And that is an extremely common thing, and it essentially functions with all drugs that you can get high from. You always experience tolerance. Why do you experience tolerance? You experience tolerance because your nervous system recognizes the activity of the outside substance that you're putting in there, like the caffeine or the cocaine or methamphetamine or whatever it might actually be. And your nervous system changes the amount of activity it exhibits to make up for whatever the drug is that you're putting in there. So if you have an individual taking a stimulant like caffeine or methamphetamine, then the nervous system will recognize the additional excitation of the cells, and it will reduce its own activity. By reducing its own activity, it cuts down on the overall effect, and then you wind up having to throw in more drug to be able to increase the activity in the nervous system again. That's where the tolerance comes from. You see the reverse as well with a sedative, where if a person's taking alcohol or barbiturates or some other substance that makes them sleepy or tired, then the nervous system will detect the lowered activity of the nervous system, and then it will begin to speed itself up as a way to counteract the presence of the drug, and thereby you'll have to throw in more of the sedative to get the same effect. So for an individual that's given sleeping pills, they will certainly develop tolerance to it because every sleeping pill that I'm aware of is something that you can get high from. And if you can get high from it, it's a guarantee that you are going to develop tolerance to it. Dependence is just kind of the other side of tolerance. Dependence refers specifically to the need to take the drug for normal functioning to occur. So if you drink 3 cups of coffee every day and you decide, oh, I'm wasting my money, why the heck am I doing this? And you go off of coffee, you're going to feel really sluggish and tired, and time's going to move slowly. And this is just like what I was saying with tolerance. If you throw in a stimulant drug and your nervous system detects the extra activity, the nerves themselves cut back on the amount of activity that they exhibit. So then when you remove the drug, you have a depressed nervous system. And that's what you refer to as dependence. Your nervous system is not functioning normally at that time because it only functioned normal with the drug present. So when you take the drug away, you experience the symptoms of dependence, and that's, of course, what you're going to wind up experiencing during detox. The opposite is, of course, true with the sedative. If you put a sedative into the nervous system, you increase the activity of the nerves that counteract the effect of the sedative. And then if you take the sedative away, you wind up with a nervous system that is overactive. And as a result, during detox, you're going to wind up with a lot of symptoms that have excessive activity, like your skin's going to crawl. You're going to be overly stimulated. You'll probably vomit a lot. You'll have bad dreams. It'll be difficult to sleep. Those are the kinds of symptoms you get from being addicted to a sedative. The opposite, when you are taking a lot of a amphetamine or another stimulant, leaves you with a depressed nervous system during detox, and then you wind up sleeping a lot. And you are very inactive during that time of detoxification from coming off of a drug that was a stimulant. So that is essentially, I kind of got ahead of myself there a little bit. That's what withdrawal is. Withdrawal always shows the opposite effect of the drug-induced effect. If a person is addicted to a stimulant, then during detox, they're going to wind up experiencing a lot of minimal behavior. They're going to sleep a lot. They're going to be very tired. They're going to feel very weak. If a person was on a sedative, then they're going to have the opposite symptoms in detox, which is going to be hyperactive nervous system, vomiting, inability to sleep, bad dreams when they do sleep, irritability. Those are the kinds of experiences the person will wind up having during those times. Now, in terms of psychology and drugs, there's a different classification system than you might say if you were just taking a pharmacology course. And the classification system here for drugs that you call psychoactive. And psychoactive is just the fancy term that means the drug influences psychological functioning. That's all it means, and it's not very specific of a term. There are three categories: stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogenics. Now, as you might know, there are many drugs that are both depressants and hallucinogenics, or stimulants and hallucinogenics. If a drug has any hallucinogenic property at all, it gets classified as a hallucinogenic. So marijuana is a very common example. And this is, if I had to bet, I would say this was going to be on the MCAT. If you classified marijuana in the psychoactive drug system here, how would you classify it? Well, marijuana gets classified as a hallucinogenic and not as a depressant. And the reason is very high doses of marijuana will cause hallucinations. And as a result, it has to get classified as an hallucinogenic because that's the categorical system that was developed. If there is no hallucinogenic process from the drug itself, then it gets either identified as a stimulant or a depressant. There really are not other kinds of activities. Drugs just produce general overall influences on an individual's behavior, but there has not yet been any drugs that are extremely specific to particular types of psychological functioning. Even today, when you take a neuroleptic to control for delusions and hallucinations and schizophrenia, there's a broad range of activity in the brain that you're affecting. It's not just affecting thought patterns and hallucinations and delusional thinking, for example. The neuroleptics that you give an individual wind up affecting a very broad range of things. And it does influence the delusions and hallucinations, but you can't deny the fact that it has a lot of other side effects as well. And that's a very important point. In fact, I'm not even certain that drugs ever actually will be that selective because of the way the neuropharmacological system in your brain is actually created. So that, we may be just using drugs today, but that eventually psychopharmacology as a treatment methodology will eventually just be dropped and replaced by more specific ways of addressing particular types of psychological disorders that don't involve a medication that functions globally throughout the brain. This leads us to the very last section of this particular lecture overall, and this one is on language. There's only 2 slides here for language, so we're going to just leave it in this part of the lecture. The story of language is fairly straightforward. One thing to be very aware of in terms of language is that there is a gene associated with the development of language, and that is the FOXP2 gene. The FOXP2 gene is present in both humans and animals, and certainly human beings have language, but if you activate the gene or overexpress it in non-humans, like in rats, you will get them to verbalize more. Now, of course, they're not creating a language, but they will verbalize more often. And so the FOXP2 gene just seems to be one piece of a much broader story of how language actually occurs. But because it is a gene associated with language, and it's one of the few that are, it's going to be highlighted. So I almost think this is a pretty much guaranteed question on the MCAT. You'll be asked about the FOXP2 gene, whether it's in humans and in animals, which it is in animals, and whether or not mutations can modify language disorders, which of course it will. In fact, you'll see the FOXP2 gene in songbirds, and if you turn the gene off, then those birds will not learn to develop those species-specific songs. Now, the next thing about the language here is the language acquisition device. And this is, frankly, the language acquisition device, I'm going to tell you, is about as useful as Sigmund Freud. Language acquisition device is a theoretical concept developed in the 50s, I believe, by Noam Chomsky. And if you ever hear about Noam Chomsky, Chomsky has for decades now been almost entirely connected to politics, and I don't believe has done much in the way of research at all. In fact, I think the last work that he did was decades ago. The language acquisition device was his baby. It was a very generalized model for the idea that all humans basically acquire language in a very similar fashion. And so the language acquisition device was this theoretical, generalized process by which a human being develops language. And this, back in the 1950s, contrasted with work in behavioral psychology, where people were trying to focus on the overt patterns of experience that an individual had. So there was, back in the 50s, a lot of debate between behavioral psychologists and individuals that were like linguists, kind of led by Noam Chomsky, who were promoting their language acquisition device. The good thing that the behaviorists were doing was that they were showing specifically environmental changes that you could identify in a clear scientific fashion that would lead to language development. Yet the linguists had the language acquisition device, which was a theoretical entity that nobody could identify in the brain back in the 1950s, but they claimed must exist based on the behavior of the individual. And that's the whole story of the language acquisition device. Nobody really uses the concept any longer. It's a thing that's basically run its course, because in the 50s, when you can't scan a brain and you can't do the neurological work that you need to be able to talk about an acquisition process, you just give it a theoretical name, a language acquisition device. Well, that's good enough. That's good enough for the time when you don't have the technical skills. Now that you have the technical skills, you actually find specific types of circuits and genes that get expressed. And unless you want to take all of the individual disconnected pieces of language development that we're aware of today and shove them into the box of language acquisition device, I don't see any reason why you would hold on to that old theoretical model. And in fact, nobody really wants to just, make sure that they maintain the language acquisition device theory. People look at genes, they look at neurological processes, they look at environmental components as well, and they look at the overall structure of language development. So there's just no real reason to hang on to this old theoretical idea. But it is what it is, as I mentioned. It was just an old theoretical idea that was supposed to account for the universality of how language was developed in human beings across the globe. To be more empirical about language, on this slide we talk about the language center. Now, the language center is for 90% of the human population in the left hemisphere. For the 10% of the population of human beings in which it is in the right hemisphere, there is no known relevant difference. Okay, it's just as sometimes things occur in biology, there is simply a different way in which a pattern gets expressed. At least up to this current point in time, nobody has detected a significant difference in language functioning between individuals who have their language center in the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere. So as an issue currently, it's a non-issue. Now, the language center decodes all of the sensory components of a message, which are typically auditory or visual, and then it leads to the development of motor functions so that you can express an idea, talk. So let's say if we go back to the earliest stages of development of language, you're going prior to the point in which there was any written language. So language was only auditory. What you've got is a scenario in which a person hears some sounds from another individual, decodes the sounds, and then makes their own sounds back to that individual. The language center is this area of your brain that decodes those original sounds and then transfers them into new sounds that get generated by your tongue and your mouth and your throat. And that's basically it. Later on, as literacy starts to develop and people start to make symbols, on cave walls or whatever it might be, you start taking a visual aspect that a person can see that they will convert into an auditory spoken component as well. And of course, now we even have things like, sign language and sign language inside of a person's hand for an individual that's blind, but that has to use sign language. So there's a variety of different ways. Braille, of course, which would not have existed 25,000 years ago. Braille is another way to do this process. So it's clear that an individual's sensory makeup is in some way connected to the language system sufficiently that you can generate symbolic meaning out of a multiple range of stimulus inputs. I imagine it would be difficult to try to do this with balance or smell or taste because you don't have probably the ability to rapidly change the types of stimuli that are coming, but sound and vision and touch can be, as stimuli can change very rapidly, and therefore you could use them as functional language stimuli. Now, earlier in this lecture, we were actually talking about the development of brain mapping and the recognition that portions of your brain control different areas of your function, your psychological function, largely because individuals would have medical disorders, closed head injuries, strokes, and so forth. And then a medical doctor would pay a family to be able to do an autopsy on the individual after they died. And this is actually where you got Broca's area and Wernicke's area from. Back in the 1800s, individuals that suffered strokes that developed language disorders were focused by medical doctors, primarily Broca and Wernicke, who were at least discovered these particular areas in anatomical work of the individuals that died sometime after a stroke. So they knew that an individual was fully functioning, had their full use of language at some particular day, had a stroke or seizure or some sort of thing, and then afterward couldn't speak. And consequently, upon autopsy, after the person died of natural causes, they began to find that individuals that had language production problems had damage in the area of the language center that was more toward the frontal lobe, where behavior is controlled. And Wernicke found that individuals that had difficulty understanding spoken language had lesions further back toward the temporal lobe. Now, see, your language center is an area on the left hemisphere that crosses functionally from the temporal lobe to the frontal lobe. Okay, it's not a lobe itself. The language center is a set of circuits that runs from the temporal lobe to the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe is, of course, for hearing. The frontal lobe is for motor behavior. So for when you see that a person has an inability to speak, that's a motor function problem, and therefore it's Broca's area, and you can pretty much be guaranteed that the damage is in the frontal lobe. If, however, the person can speak but they can't understand, that would indicate that the damage is going to be in the temporal lobe, where the sound is actually decoded before a person can have that signal sent over to the frontal lobe so that they can generate a new language or new sentences to speak back to the original speaker. And that concludes this section on behavioral neuroscience and sensation.